I've talked about, early specialisation, late specialisation. We now actually need to look and define, I talked about figure skating and gymnastics. It's important to define what sports are early and late specialisation sports. So how do we categorise early versus late specialisation sports? So, more complex sports require highly developed muscle control and coordination, as well as refined visual tracking abilities. Sports that are not as technically complex do not require early entry. So by assessing the complexity of these various sports, we can categorise them as early versus late specialisation sports. Different specialisation categories are then proposed to help parents and youth sport leaders better understand the optimal and preferred times for young athletes to begin their focus on a particular training or sport. Early specialisation sports include things like acrobatic sports such as figure skating, gymnastics and diving. Early sport-specific training from 5 to 7 is needed for elite talent development. Specialisation happens at 9 to 13 years of age. It is also recommended early specialisation for sports that are highly kinesthetic, that require precise techniques such as swimming, so between 8 and 13 years of age, and then in equestrian events where early engagement in riding is needed, potentially to specialise in a particular area of equestrian at around 14. Females typically specialise 2 years earlier than males in these activities because of their early maturation. So again, they'll figure skating, gymnastics, diving, you'll see the female athletes being younger than the male athletes, particularly, if you watch, the Olympics and saw the gymnastics, you'll see some very young participants in the female arena. Okay, so late specialisation sports are all other sports which are late specialisation sports. Although within that late specialisation, they can be categorised based on whether they require some early engagement. So we need to get the kids involved in this activity at an early age, so younger than 8. Several sports require early engagement, but not specialisation, but early participation to gain the needed feel, visual tracking and decision-making abilities for these sports. These late specialisation, early engagement sports are divided into kinesthetic, team and visual sports. So focusing on what I've just looked at, I'll actually show you this model you can see on screen from early to late specialisation. You can see on the one side you've got those acrobatic, highly kinesthetic activities which involves the early specialisation. And then you've got some key sports where you would like some early engagement. What early engagement means is that kids are going to play these sports these activities, but they're not just going to focus on those sports in particular. They're going to still take part in other sports, but it's important that we engage them in these activities. The early engagement in terms of the kinesthetic could be the kind of snow sports such as skiing and snowboarding. The team ones, where we need to look to develop those visual and decision-making skills such as ice hockey, basketball, baseball, netball, soccer or field hockey and so forth. And then the visual skills, which you need to start to have engagement in, are things like tennis, badminton, racquetball, squash and so forth. It's making sure that kids have some engagement in those activities from sort of 8 years or earlier. So as a model, I would look at developing those key motor skills from 4 to sort of 7, and then start to put them in team activities where they're going to experience all these sports, develop those transferable skills that they may get from playing soccer to field hockey and so forth. So it's going to help them being involved in lots of sports. Within this late specialisation area is a common kind of late specialisation sports. So again, it's repeating some of those sports we've talked about, but also add some other areas that are going to specialise. So we're not going to get kids specialising in things like speed skating, wrestling, lacrosse, rugby, some of those kind of more combat sports, so such as your karate, judo, weightlifting, boxing, taekwondo. So again, it's sampling lots of these different activities and developing these key skills. And then finally, the very top end of that late specialisation is very late or transfer from things like cycling, rowing and kayaking. So focusing on those, kinesthetic sports categorises late specialisation, early engagement such as skiing require early engagement to develop the feel and balance. Team sports in this category require the kinesthetic feel for, the stick moving to receive a pass, the visual tracking to track the ball and kick it or receive it and catch it. The complex decision making needed in football or soccer. The visual sports are those sports that require early engagement and late specialisation, such as tennis, where the visual tracking of objects, that handheld implements, that hand-eye coordination is important. Although early engagement around 8 years, slightly younger, begins to code the brain for these activities, specialisation is not needed until the sort of 14 to 16. Late specialisation sports are categorised as common include football, speed skating, track and field, volleyball, golf and so forth. Common means that they require specialisations not typically suggested by research until they are 13 or 16 years of age. Some of these sports typically require early experience in terms of visual tracking, as well as hand-eye coordination and balance. And certainly there are specialised positions within these sports that may require some engagement in, such as the setting in volleyball. Very late specialisation sports are those cycling and kayak, where the training requirements are high, involve power and volume. Of training is quite tough. But there's also known transfers from other sports into these sports, which may help with that process of late specialisation. So looking at this sport-specific categorisation system, the people who put this together applied the LTD model with a multitude of athletes and teams across levels. The experience led them to propose these categories for early and late specialisation, which is useful to model from to begin studying the timing and training in relation to the achievement of elite status in various sports. Obviously, the exact categorisation of specific sports is arguable, and the systems it's just a valuable tool to understand across the sports. So there may be athletes that don't fit this exact mould. But I guess an example from earlier, I draw down from, if you want to be a good soccer player, you need to develop the balance and coordination. If you want to be a good, baseball rounders, someone that involves batting the ball, they need to experience multitudes of experiences or activities where they involve tracking and developing hand-eye coordination, and visually be able to, see where the ball is as they kind of strike at it. So the kind of key messages from looking at these early late specialisation sports is around the same emphasis that's been kind of put forward to you is around developing lots of activities, lots of sampling and experiencing lots of activities at that early age, develop those motor skills to hopefully create a bigger pool of talent development and more talented athletes